London is a city built on ghosts. Walk through the financial district today and you see towers of glass, bright lights, and the endless motion of the modern world. But beneath the pavement lies another city, buried under centuries of construction. A city of timber, stone, and bone. A city that vanished nearly 400 years ago. For generations, the true face of medieval London has been hidden from us. Historians relied on faded drawings, fragments of archaeological remains, and scattered descriptions written in ancient chronicles. From those clues, we tried to imagine the past, the cramped alleys, the towering church spires, and the filthy streets of a medieval metropolis. But today, something remarkable has changed. By combining historical records with modern artificial intelligence and digital reconstruction, researchers are beginning to peel back the layers of time. We are not simply describing medieval London anymore. We are rebuilding it, stone by stone, street by street. From the shadow of its fortress walls to the roar of its markets, technology is helping us resurrect the lost city. And the London that emerges is far stranger, louder, and more chaotic than most people imagine. London was not always the vast city we know today. In the medieval era, it was something closer to a cage. The boundaries of the city were defined by the ancient Roman wall, a 2-mile circuit of thick stone rising nearly 20 feet high. Built centuries earlier by Roman engineers, the wall still dominated the landscape and controlled who could enter or leave. Inside those walls, the entire city was compressed into barely 1 square mile. By the 14th century, nearly 40,000 people lived inside this tiny space. Homes, workshops, churches, taverns, and markets were crammed together in a chaotic tangle of timber buildings and narrow streets. The city grew not according to a plan, but organically. It twisted and spread like roots through the soil. To enter London, travelers had to pass through one of the 7 great gates: Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, or Aldgate. These were not simple entrances. They were heavily fortified checkpoints, complete with guards, toll collectors, and sometimes even prisons built into the gatehouses. Passing beneath one of these massive arches marked a dramatic change. Behind you was the open countryside. Ahead of you was medieval London. And the first thing most visitors noticed was the smell. Medieval London was overwhelmingly loud and crowded. This was a pedestrian city where the streets were so narrow that carts often scraped against the walls of the houses on either side. There was no organized urban planning. Buildings appeared wherever space allowed, and because land inside the walls was incredibly valuable, citizens began building upward. Many houses were constructed with overhanging upper floors that extended out above the street. Each level projected farther than the one below it, creating a stacked structure known as jettying. The result was a strange urban landscape. The buildings leaned toward each other until the streets below became shadowy tunnels. Sunlight rarely reached the ground. Even during the day, some alleys were permanently dim. This was a city that pressed in from every direction. But towering above this forest of timber was something far more intimidating. On the eastern edge of the city stood the ultimate symbol of royal power: the Tower of London. At the center of the fortress rose the White Tower, built shortly after the Norman conquest by William the Conqueror. This was not meant to be a palace for the enjoyment of the people. It was designed as a weapon, a psychological one. Constructed from bright white cane stone imported from France, the tower gleamed across the skyline like a foreign object planted in the heart of England. And in many ways, that is exactly what it was. For the Anglo-Saxon population, the fortress served as a constant reminder that they had been conquered. Over the centuries, the tower expanded into a massive military complex. Kings added new defensive walls and surrounded the fortress with a deep moat connected to the River Thames. It became one of the most secure fortresses in Europe. Inside its walls, the tower served many purposes. It housed a royal mint where coins were struck. It held royal treasure. It even contained a strange and exotic zoo known as the Royal Menagerie. Visitors could see lions, leopards, and even a polar bear, gifts from foreign monarchs, living inside the fortress. But the tower was most famous for something far darker. It was a prison. Prisoners accused of treason were often brought through the Traitor's Gate, a water entrance beneath the walls that allowed boats to deliver prisoners directly from the Thames. For many of them, entering the tower meant disappearing from the world forever. If the tower was the city's iron fist, London Bridge was its lifeline. For centuries, this was the only bridge crossing the Thames. Every traveler arriving from the south had to pass over it. Completed in 1209, the bridge rested on 19 massive stone arches and stretched across the powerful currents of the river. But it did not look like a bridge. It looked like a street. Both sides of the roadway were lined with houses and shops that rose as high as 7 stories above the water. The buildings leaned outward so dramatically that they nearly touched across the narrow road. Crossing the bridge was an unforgettable experience. The street was constantly clogged with carts, animals, merchants, and travelers. Beneath your feet, the river surged violently through the narrow arches. The structure acted almost like a dam, forcing the tide through tight gaps and creating dangerous rapids. Boatmen called the terrifying maneuver of navigating these currents shooting the bridge. Many drowned trying. And at the southern gatehouse of the bridge, travelers were greeted with a grim warning. Rows of iron spikes displayed the severed heads of executed traitors. Preserved in tar, the heads stared out across the river, a brutal reminder of the power of London law. Rising above the city skyline stood the spiritual heart of medieval England, Old St. Paul's Cathedral. The cathedral that exists today was designed centuries later by Christopher Wren, but the medieval version was a very different structure. It was a gigantic Gothic cathedral. By the 14th century, it was one of the longest churches in the world, dominating the skyline of London. Its most striking feature was the spire. Nearly 500 feet tall, it pierced the sky like a stone needle and could be seen for miles across the countryside. For travelers approaching London, the spire served as a landmark guiding them toward the city. Yet inside the cathedral, things were not always peaceful. The massive central aisle, known as Paul's Walk, functioned less like a sacred space and more like a public square. Merchants negotiated deals, lawyers met clients, rumors and gossip spread through the crowd. Even pickpockets and prostitutes operated inside the cathedral. The sacred and the ordinary mixed together beneath the same vast roof. Outside, at Paul's Cross, fiery preachers delivered sermons to thousands of listeners, sometimes sparking riots or political movements. It was the perfect reflection of medieval London itself, a place where religion, business, and daily life collided.
If St. Paul's represented the spiritual power of London, the Guildhall represented its economic power. Here, the city's powerful merchant guilds governed themselves. Organizations such as the fishmongers, goldsmiths, mercers, and drapers controlled the production and sale of goods. These guilds were far more than simple trade associations. They regulated who could work in a profession, controlled product quality, and fixed prices. Inside the Grand Hall, lavish feasts and political meetings were held beneath the legendary statues of the giants Gog and Magog. The guilds held enormous influence. Kings might wear the crown, but London's merchants controlled the money. Without their financial support, royal armies could not be paid, and wars could not be fought. In many ways, the Guildhall was the true engine of the city. If the Guildhall was the brain of the economy, the markets were its stomach. The busiest of all was Cheapside. The name comes from the Old English word cheap, meaning market. Here, in the shadow of St. Mary Le Bow Church, the largest and most vibrant marketplace in London exploded with activity. The city was carefully organized by trade. Bread Street sold bread. Milk Street sold milk. Poultry Street sold poultry. The air was filled with the shouts of vendors advertising their goods, fresh fish, hot peas, roasted meats, and vegetables from the countryside. The noise was so intense that some claimed you could barely hear the church bells above it. At the center of the market stood the great conduit where free water flowed for citizens. Nearby stood the Standard, a place where criminals were publicly punished. Justice here was swift and humiliating. A baker caught selling underweight bread might be dragged through the streets with the loaf tied around his neck. Dishonest merchants could be locked in the pillory while crowds mocked them. Public shame was the primary tool of law enforcement. 2 miles upriver from the crowded city stood another center of power, Westminster. Most Londoners traveled there by boat, using the Thames as a watery highway. At the heart of Westminster stood one of the greatest medieval halls in Europe, Westminster Hall. Built in the 11th century and later expanded by Richard II, the hall featured a magnificent hammer-beam roof spanning nearly 70 feet without central pillars. The vast wooden structure seemed to float above visitors. This was the stage where the drama of English monarchy unfolded. Coronation banquets were held here, with fountains flowing with wine and elaborate ceremonies celebrating the king's authority. But it was also a place of judgment. England's highest courts operated inside this hall. It was here that major political trials took place and where historic figures faced their fate. Even the Scottish hero William Wallace was condemned within these walls. For ordinary citizens, entering Westminster Hall was meant to be intimidating. The architecture itself made people feel small beneath the weight of royal power. Step away from the grand buildings and into a narrow side alley, and you entered the everyday world of medieval Londoners. Most citizens lived in tall, narrow timber houses. The ground floor usually served as a shop or workshop. The family lived above it. A steep ladder led to the main living space called the solar. Inside, the rooms were dark and smoky. Glass windows were rare and expensive. Instead, openings were covered with cloth soaked in oil or thin sheets of translucent horn. Light filtered in a dull yellow glow. The air smelled of wood smoke and burning tallow candles made from animal fat. Privacy barely existed. Entire families ate, slept, and worked in the same single room. They slept on straw mattresses and covered the floor with rushes and herbs meant to mask the smell of daily life. Beneath those fresh rushes often lay layers of old food scraps, spilled ale, and dirt tracked in from the streets. Life was hard, crowded, and often uncomfortable. But this was the reality for thousands of Londoners. For centuries, this skyline remained unchanged. The stone churches and fortress towers watched over a city built mostly from wood, straw, and pitch. But the very materials that built medieval London also guaranteed its destruction. In 1666, a small spark inside a bakery on Pudding Lane ignited the dry timber houses. Strong winds quickly turned the fire into an unstoppable inferno. The flames raced through the narrow streets. Wooden buildings burned like kindling. The fire consumed London Bridge, destroyed houses, and melted the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral. Molten metal poured through the streets like rivers. After 4 days of destruction, the medieval city was gone, reduced to ash. From those ruins, a new London would rise, built from brick, stone, and wider streets designed to prevent another disaster. But beneath the foundations of modern London, the medieval city still sleeps. Its streets, walls, and forgotten foundations remain hidden underground. And thanks to modern technology, we're finally beginning to see that lost world again.